Olá, eu sou a Vanessa Barbosa, jornalista do site Exame.com. É pedido do IBA, eu estou aqui para um bate-papo com o economista Tim Jackson. Ele é professor da Universidade de Surrey, na Inglaterra, e autor do livro Prosperidade sem Crescimento, Vida Boa num Planeta Finito. Esse livro acabou de ganhar uma versão em português pelo selo do Planeta Sustentável. So, hi Tim, it's a pleasure to have
Hi.
you here.
Good to be here.
Let's start with the basics. Tim, why should we question growth when it's been considered a sign of progress over the last century?
Well, I think first of all we should definitely consider whether it is really a sign of progress, and that's what the book tries to do, is to say that prosperity is a very clear notion about our well-being, about the quality of our life, about the good life, and typically we believe that this prosperity is delivered to us through economic growth, through a continually growing economy. And yet it's clear that the two things aren't the same. Being well is not necessarily about having more stuff. Having more stuff sometimes helps us to do well, but sometimes it actually undermines our well-being, and particularly when it has an impact on the environment, and particularly when it is not possible to give everybody the same amount of material stuff. You still want to be able to say it's possible for everybody to have a good life, to have prosperity. So the book is about teasing apart those two things and saying prosperity is one thing that we can understand very well in human terms, but it isn't always the same thing as economic growth. And sometimes the economy, the expansion of the economy, can undermine the prosperity that we'd like to have. And it's just taking a little moment to ask the question, is prosperity really the same thing as economic growth? Not particularly. And then going from there, seeing where that exploration, where that discussion takes us.
Yeah, right. So, what are the evidence showing that beyond a certain point, growth does not increase the human well-being?
Yes, well, it's worth saying first that there is evidence that growth does increase well-being in the poorest countries. So the poorest people, if you increase the income of the poorest people, then there's very strong evidence to show that they have longer life expectancy, they have better health, they have better education, and they are happier. Life satisfaction is higher if you can increase the income of poor countries. But in the rich countries, it's just not the same. After a certain per capita income, all of those statistics begin to tail off. They begin to be much flatter. And so that you get a lot of income growth, but without a lot of increase in prosperity, without a lot of increase in education or in health. And in some cases, you have some very rich countries with lots of income growth, but lower life expectancy than countries who are very much poorer. And so what you can see from that is that this equation of income growth with prosperity, with well-being, works at the very low income level, and then it stops working.
So how do you make this change in a developed country, a rich country? How can it achieve prosperity with a new kind of growth? What's the path to prosperity if growth is not good enough already to...
In some ways, that's the most difficult question of all. The first thing you have to do is to understand the situation, so understand where we are, that we built a growth-based economy believing that this would deliver us prosperity, and it did up to a point, but now we have to free ourselves from it, if you like. And so the freeing ourselves from it really is about making sure that we can build an economy in which it's possible to employ people, an economy in which it's possible to invest in the future, an economy in which it's possible to provide the goods and services that create the quality of our lives. And that's really what the book does. It sets out those things. It sets out what enterprise would look like in such an economy, what investment would look like in such an economy, how people would work in such an economy, how you could maintain employment in such an economy. And the mechanics of that are very challenging. They're challenging from an economic point of view, they're challenging from a social point of view. But the reality is that is the kind of economy that we need to work for, because the alternative is an economy in which everyone, 9 billion people in 2050, are all chasing after material growth on a finite planet. And this is really an economy that couldn't work at all.
Okay. In the beginning of your answer, you mentioned how important it is to free people. In your book, you define consumerism as an iron cage. What do you mean by that, and how to free people from that?
Yeah, it's important to realise that what we did was to create a consumer society. And we did it for a very particular reason. We became very good at technology. We became very good at producing lots of goods, lots of material things. And yet it's no good producing all this stuff if you haven't got people to buy it. So in the 1940s, 50s, 60s in particular, there was a big emphasis on creating consumerism, creating the appetite for material goods, so that and it went through advertising, through marketing, through incentives to persuade people to consume, and then later through the building up of debt as a way to allow people to go into debt but to keep on spending on material goods and things. So the first thing to really realize is how we deliberately created consumerism to save the economy from collapse, from unemployment. And now we're sort of saddled with it. And we're saddled with it in two ways. We're saddled with it because this is how our economy works, and without consumerism, it begins to stop working. And we're also saddled with it because consumerism didn't just come out of nowhere. This idea of being addicted to material things actually has its roots inside us. It has its roots in our own desire for novelty. It has its roots in our desire for status, for recognition in society. And all of these things, these very, very important things to ordinary people, become cashed out, if you like, through being consumers, through having material things. And this is why it's an iron cage, because it isn't just imposed on us from above, it's actually a part of our fabric to be, if you like, kids in the candy shop, just with a ferocious appetite for, the latest new consumer gadgets or toys or whatever it might be. And so freeing ourselves from it really, again, is two tasks. One is saying we deliberately created this thing. What if we started to disassemble? What if we started actually to talk more about citizen values than consumer values? What if we gave people the ability to flourish, to have social good, to have a sense of community, to have strong friendships, to participate in society? What if we built this in a less materialistic way? So this is really the twin strategy. One is to dismantle a strategy that deliberately built up consumerism, and the other is to give people real opportunities to do well, to have a good quality of life outside the market, outside the buying and selling and wasting of stuff.
Okay, so your answer leads me to my next question, is one might claim that the profit-driven economics are in accord with the natural motivations of people who are inherently selfish. How do you respond to that?
I say that there is a selfish component in the human psyche. I think it's silly to ignore that, and it's one of the things that makes consumerism so attractive. But it's also true, and psychology supports this, that there is an altruistic component in the human psyche as well, an other regarding component in the human psyche. And what we are, rather than just being selfish, is we're like a tension between these two things. We never quite know who we are. Am I a selfish, greedy materialist, or do I care about other people? The reality is it's both. Mm-hmm. And just as we seek novelty, just as we crave new stuff, we also have a hankering after tradition, after history, after longevity, after things that last. And these two things are also in a tension in us. And so my answer to that question is yes, there is a selfish component, but this was never all we were as human beings. Actually, what we are is much more complex, much more rounded. And the answer, in a way, to building a different kind of economics, a different kind of society, is say, forget this notion that human beings are just novelty-seeking, selfish consumers. That's a part of us. But open up your eyes and see actually who we are as a whole, how we have other regarding behaviours, how we care about tradition, how we love our families and friends, how we care about other people. This is all being human as well. And this more rounded view of who we are as humans is actually a very good starting point for building a different kind of, a different idea about economics.
Who can lead this change in people and make people be more sustainable? I mean, governments, enterprises, or school teachers. Who can lead us to a more sustainable behavior?
The change has to come from everywhere. It can't just come from one place. The one thing you can say that is impossible to do is for government sitting here with all the power and the authority telling those poor people out there, those consumers, that they shouldn't be consumers anymore. This doesn't work. It's actually morally wrong for one set of people in power to tell another set of people who have no power that they should give up even more power by not having any consumer things and therefore giving up their social status. You can't, it doesn't work like that. So actually, from that understanding, you then have to think about how the change has to be built. It has to be built by giving people real opportunities. Can people give themselves real opportunities? Yes, sometimes of course they can. They can make simple choices about how they live, where they invest their money, what they spend that money on. And they can, and then you ask, well, is that a task for businesses? And yes, of course, it is a task also for businesses. Businesses can run themselves differently. They can put the care of community above the pursuit of profit. They can look after the way that their supply chains operate, so they're not buying slave labor to produce cheap goods to continually enhance their profit, and so on and so forth. So businesses also have a role to play. My principal concern in the book was to say, what would governments need to do? What would be the change in the institutions, the change in the incentives, the change in the infrastructure that would be needed? And I continue to believe that government is very, very important. It's government who sets the framing conditions for society, and they continue to have a role to do that. Change can happen without that government leadership, but it will be much, much more difficult.
Okay, so could you point to us which would be the change that governments could make to create this infrastructure?
Yep, it's a range of things really. Some of that range is really about making sure that we protect the ecological resources, that we don't simply degrade the environment, that we look after and account for the impact on biodiversity, the impact on climate change. And then there's a set of things which are around economics, and the economic things. One of the principal tasks of government, it seems to me, is to develop an economics, to build an economics that doesn't depend inherently on growth, and to make sure that the financial sector in particular works properly in that. So the regulation of the financial sector, the making sure that we have sufficient assets to cover our liabilities, the looking after the balance sheet of society, if you like, the balance sheet of the economy. This is a really important task, fixing the economics. And there are very good reasons for doing that already, particularly after the crisis, because it became very clear how fragile the economic system that we built was. And so this is one of the important areas. And then finally, I would say this: the third area is this question of the iron cage, of the social logic itself. Government systematically gives out signals about how people should think and how they should behave and how they should act and what they should buy and whether they should go into debt. And so in a way, the task of government is to systematically actually to create a civil society rather than a consumer society, and to invest in that society. Social investment in education, in health, in social care, in public spaces, in renovating public buildings, in looking after the culture of society. This is a huge task, and it's very much government's task.
Tim, I'd like to know your opinion about GDP as an indicator of wealth and prosperity. What would be the best way to measure a nation's economic and social health? Do you think GDP does?
It's very clear that GDP doesn't do that. GDP measures, you could say, the busyness of society. It measures how much we produce, it measures how much we consume, it measures how much is going on in the economy. But it's a very, very poor measure of what we're doing, for example, to even what we're doing to financial assets and liabilities, even what we're doing at the balance sheet level doesn't appear in the GDP at all. And so it fails to pick up when we run down our financial stocks, it fails to pick it up when we run down our natural capital, it fails to pick it up when we undermine the social health of our communities. All of these things are missing from the GDP, and so we desperately need measures which are fit for purpose. And to my mind, it's not as though there's a single measure that you can take off the shelf and substitute with GDP. You have to think about the kind of society that you want. So you need, for example, to have full employment, so you need to measure employment. You need to have a healthy population, so you need to have measures of health. You need to have a consistent, sustainable resource base, so you need to measure your supply chains and your resource base. And these three areas, the area of the economy itself, the area of health and society, and the area of ecological resources, these are the three areas where we need to have indicators that tell us about the health of our society. If you think about, driving a car or flying a plane, you can't do those kinds of tasks with just one measure. You couldn't just drive the car on the basis of a speedometer, because you need to know what's happening in your engine, whether it's overheating. You need to know whether your indicator's on or off. You need to know whether your lights are on and off. It's the same with an economy. You can't drive an economy just on the basis of one single indicator that is not a very good measure of progress.
That's right. Tim, do you see any changes going on right now towards the more sustainable world? Why I ask you this? Between the recession and the growing divide between the rich and the poor, we saw the flourishment of the collaborative consumption, the sharing economy. Is that a more sustainable, resource-efficient way of living, in your view?
Yes, it is. It uses resources more efficiently. It changes the pattern of ownership, and it means that people are really sharing the resources available in a much more equitable way. So the sharing, the collaborative economy is one example of change. I would say the emergence of the transition town movement is another, where communities come together and think about a transition away from fossil fuels and towards a more sustainable future. Another example of change is the rise of the so-called benefit corporations. So enterprises who work as enterprises, supplying goods and services to people in the community, but instead of just being driven by the maximization of shareholder profit, they're driven partly by the interests to community and by the protection, but by ecological and social goals, specifically driven by ecological and social goals. So everywhere you look, really, there are changes. Some of them really exciting changes in the financial sector, for example, the rise of community banks and community funding. In the food sector, the rise of slow food. In the energy sector, the rise of community energy developments. Lots of places where you look where ordinary people are already doing real things that make for a better economy. And that's a very encouraging thing to see.
What about in developing countries that still need to grow, still need this search for progress and this prosperity? What change can happen in these places right now?
Yeah, I would say everybody needs a search for prosperity. Everyone needs to have a sense of a goal of something becoming better in life. So it is true. It's true of every economy. But the point you're asking really is about the poorest economies, where the evidence tells us very clearly that income growth will deliver benefits in those economies in terms of real prosperity of people. And so it is important in those economies to have an economic model that works. And in the early stages, working really does mean raising the incomes of the poorest in society, to give them basic rights to housing, to decent clothes, to nutrition, to health, to education, giving that possibility of a decent life to ordinary people. So that's very important. And it does in some places mean growth. It does mean income growth in some places. The trick, in a way, particularly for the emerging economies, is to be able to deliver those social benefits, to deliver that prosperity to the poorest, without becoming addicted to growth in the way that the Western economies have become, without becoming addicted to consumerism, without becoming addicted to debt, without creating the same fragility that that actually has been very destructive in the Western economies. So the challenge is to develop, yes, definitely to develop, and in some cases to grow, but to develop into a more robust economy, a more sustainable economy, a lasting economy that has solid foundations in what people really need, within the limits of a finite planet.
So do you think there can be a sustainable capitalism?
It's maybe. It's a question really about words. I mean, it sort of depends what you think capitalism is. If you think capitalism is consumer-driven financial capitalism that's created havoc in the way that we've seen in the financial crisis, then I would say no, we can't have such a sustainable thing. It's almost a contradiction in terms to think of those two words. But is capitalism really that, or is it about protecting the assets, the capital on which we depend for our prosperity? In this form, you could say, well, maybe we could have a sustainable capitalism. I think it's almost, a question of whether you like the word or not. Those who like the words like to say that we're going to keep the word, and so we must have a sustainable capitalism. But those who don't like the word say you must get rid of that word because it stands for everything that's bad about economics and about society. My view is a middle view. I don't care so much about what the word is. I think what is important is to lay down the foundations for a sustainable economy, an economy that lasts, an economy that respects nature, an economy in which everyone has a chance of a decent life. And whether you end up calling it capitalism or not, I'm not so worried about that.
Okay, last question. Is it really possible, thinking about over the next 30 years, that in 2050, when global population will hit 9 billion, to grow, to achieve prosperity without growth, if we start now?
I would ask a different question, actually. I would ask whether it's possible, particularly for the rich Western nations, to continue to grow that long. Because actually what's happening in the most developed nations is that the growth rates have been gradually declining over some time. So even before the crisis happened, it was clear, or it should have been clear actually, that growth might just not be possible in the richest nations over a longer period of time. And in those circumstances, you're in a very different world. You're not challenging the dominant model. You're saying actually the dominant model is already dead in the water. We're already in a different world now. And now we have to learn, maybe from a hard place, how to build a real prosperity without even the possibility of growth. Now, that's not going to happen immediately. There are still some ways that we can grow economies, but the long-term challenge actually is rather that prosperity is essential, and that growth may slow down for all sorts of reasons, environmental reasons, social reasons, economic reasons themselves. And so our challenge really is to think what happens after growth, to think what happens, how we build an economy fit for purpose.
Just a curiosity, Tim. Have you ever been accused of being anti-progress?
Yes.
Yes. And how do you define yourself?
Absolutely not. I mean, to me, prosperity, the heart of the word prosperity is the Latin word for hope. And hope is the most important thing about progress. It's about the idea that the world is getting better, that the world for my children will be better than the world that I live in. The world for their children is a place where things will be better again. And you can see the progress of society in some ways, not as just as the progress of having more and more stuff, but the progress of having a better governance, stronger society, more resilient communities, better, more expressed human values, more equality, more ability for more people actually to participate. And that to me is the essence of progress. It's not just that very simple, inadequate indicator of having more money, more stuff. It's a much richer concept, much more worthwhile fighting for.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Tim, for this conversation.
Thank you.
É isso aí, pessoal. A gente fica por aqui e esperamos que vocês tenham gostado. Até mais.